Bonnie and Clyde, reviewed by Pauline Kael. The New Yorker, October 13th, 1967. How do you make a good movie in this country without being jumped on? Bonnie and Clyde is the most excitingly American movie since The Manchurian Candidate. The audience is alive to it. Our experience as we watch it has some connection with the way we reacted to movies in childhood, with how we came to love them and to feel they were ours. Not an art that we learned over the years to appreciate, but simply and immediately ours. When an American movie is contemporary in feeling, like this one, it makes a different kind of contact with an American audience from the kind that is made by European films, however contemporary. Yet any movie that is contemporary in feeling is likely to go further than other movies, go too far for some tastes, and Bonnie and Clyde divides audiences, as The Manchurian Candidate did, and it is being jumped on almost as hard. Though we may dismiss the attacks with, "What good movie doesn't give some offense?" The fact that it is generally only good movies that provoke attacks by many people suggests that the innocuousness of most of our movies is accepted with such complacence that when an American movie reaches people, when it makes them react, some of them think that there must be something the matter with it. Perhaps a law should be passed against it. Bonnie and Clyde brings into the almost frighteningly public world of movies things that people have been feeling and saying and writing about. And once something is said or done on the screens of the world, once it has entered mass art, it can never again belong to a minority, never again be the private possession of an educated or knowing group. But even for that group, there is an excitement in hearing its own private thoughts expressed out loud and in seeing something of its own sensibility become part of our own common culture. Our best movies have always made entertainment out of the anti-heroism of American life. They bring to the surface what, in its newest forms and fashions, is always just below the surface. The romanticism in American movies lies in the cynical, tough guy's independence. The sentimentality lies, traditionally, in the falsified finish when the anti-hero turns hero. In 1967, this kind of sentimentality wouldn't work with the audience, and Bonnie and Clyde substitutes sexual fulfillment for a change of heart. This doesn't quite work either. Audiences sophisticated enough to enjoy a movie like this one are too sophisticated for the dramatic uplift of the triumph over impotence. Structurally, Bonnie and Clyde is a story of love on the run, like the old Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert It Happened One Night, but turned inside out. The walls of Jericho are psychological this time, but they fall anyway. If the story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow seemed almost from the start, and even to them while they were living it, to be the material of legend, it's because robbers who are loyal to each other, like the James brothers, are a grade up from garden variety robbers. And if they're male and female partners in crime, and young and attractive, they're a rare breed. The Barrow gang had both family loyalty and sex appeal working for their legend. David Newman and Robert Benton, who wrote the script for Bonnie and Clyde, were able to use the knowledge that, like many of our other famous outlaws and gangsters, the real Bonnie and Clyde seemed to others to be acting out forbidden roles and to relish their roles. In contrast with secret criminals, the furtive embezzlers and other crooks who lead seemingly honest lives, the known outlaws capture the public imagination because they take chances, and often because they enjoy dramatizing their lives. They know that newspaper readers want all the details they can get about the criminals who do the terrible things they themselves don't dare to do, and also want the satisfaction of reading about the punishment after feasting on the crimes. Outlaws play to this public. They show off their big guns and fancy clothes and their defiance of the law. Bonnie and Clyde established the images for their own legend in the photographs they posed for, the gunman and the gun moll. The naive, touching doggerel ballad that Bonnie Parker wrote and had published in newspapers is about the roles they play for other people, contrasted with the coming end for them. It concludes, "Someday they'll go down together, they'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." That they did capture the public imagination is evidenced by the many movies based on their lives. In the late 40s, there were They Live by Night with Farley Granger and Kathy O'Donnell, and Gun Crazy with John Dall and Peggy Cummins. Alfred Hitchcock, in the same period, cast these two Clyde Barrows, Dall and Granger, as Loeb and Leopold in Rope. And there was a cheap, in every sense, 1958 exploitation film, The Bonnie Parker Story, starring Dorothy Provine. But the most important earlier version was Fritz Lang's You Only Live Once, starring Sylvia Sidney as Joan and Henry Fonda as Eddie, which was made in 1937. This version, which was one of the best films of the 30s, as Bonnie and Clyde is of the 60s, expressed certain feelings of its time, as this film expresses certain feelings of ours. They Live by Night, produced by John Houseman under the aegis of Dore Schary and directed by Nicholas Ray, was a very serious and socially significant tragic melodrama. But its attitudes were already dated 30s attitudes. The lovers were very young and pure and frightened and underprivileged. The hardened criminals were sordid. The settings were committedly grim. It made no impact on the post-war audience, though it was a great success in England, where our moldy, socially significant movies could pass for courageous. Just how contemporary in feeling Bonnie and Clyde is may be indicated by contrasting it with You Only Live Once, which, though almost totally false to the historical facts, was told straight. It is a peculiarity of our times, perhaps it's one of the few specifically modern characteristics, that we don't take our stories straight anymore. This isn't necessarily bad. Bonnie and Clyde is the first film demonstration that the put-on can be used for the purposes of art. The Manchurian Candidate almost succeeded in that, but what was implicitly wild and far out in the material was nevertheless presented on screen as a straight thriller. Bonnie and Clyde keeps the audience in a kind of eager, nervous imbalance, holds our attention by throwing our disbelief back in our faces. To be put on is to be put on the spot, put on the stage, made the stooge in a comedy act. People in the audience at Bonnie and Clyde are laughing, demonstrating that they're not stooges, that they appreciate the joke when they catch the first bullet fight in the face. The movie keeps them off balance to the end. During the first part of the picture, a woman in my row was gleefully assuring her companions, "It's a comedy, it's a comedy." After a while, she didn't say anything. Instead of the movie spoof, which tells the audience that it doesn't need to feel or care, that it's all just in fun, that we were only kidding, Bonnie and Clyde disrupts us with, "And you thought we were only kidding." This is the way the story was told in 1937. Eddie, Clyde, is a 3-time loser who wants to work for a living, but nobody will give him a chance. Once you get on the wrong side of the law, They won't let you get back. Eddie knows it's hopeless. Once a loser, always a loser. But his girl, Joan, Bonnie, the only person who believes in him, thinks that an innocent man has nothing to fear. She marries him and learns better. Arrested again and sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit, Eddie asks her to smuggle a gun to him in prison. And she protests, "If I get you a gun, you'll kill somebody." He stares at her sullenly and asks, "What do you think they're going to do to me?" He becomes a murderer while escaping from prison. Society has made him what it thought he was all along. You Only Live Once was an indictment of society, of the forces of order that will not give Eddie the outcast a chance. "We have a right to live," Joan says, as they set out across the country. During the time they are on the run, they become notorious outlaws. They are blamed for a series of crimes they didn't commit. They do commit hold-ups, but only to get gas or groceries or medicine. While the press pictures them as desperados robbing and killing and living high on the proceeds of crime, she is having a baby in a shack in a hobo jungle, and Eddie brings her a bouquet of wild flowers. Caught in a police trap, they die in each other's arms. They have been denied the right to live. Because You Only Live Once was so well done, and because the audience in the 30s shared this view of the indifference and cruelty of society, there were no protests against the sympathetic way the outlaws were pictured, and indeed there was no reason for any. In 1958, in I Want to Live, a very popular, though not very good, movie, Barbara Graham, a drug addict prostitute who had been executed for her share in the bludgeoning to death of an elderly woman, was presented as gallant, wronged, morally superior to everyone else in the movie, in order to strengthen the argument against capital punishment. And the director, Robert Wise, and his associates weren't accused of glorifying criminals, because the criminals, as in You Only Live Once, weren't criminals but innocent victims. Why the protests? Why are so many people upset, and not just the people who enjoy indignation, about Bonnie and Clyde, in which the criminals are criminals? Clyde, an ignorant, sly, near psychopath who thinks his crimes are accomplishments, and Bonnie, a bored, restless waitress slut who robs for excitement. And why so many accusations of historical inaccuracy, particularly against a work that is far more accurate historically than most, and in which historical accuracy hardly matters anyway? There is always an issue of historical accuracy involved in any dramatic or literary work set in the past. Indeed, it's fun to read about Richard III versus Shakespeare's Richard III. The issue is always with us, and will be always with us as long as artists find stimulus in historical figures and want to present their versions of them. But why didn't movie critics attack, for example, A Man for All Seasons, which involves material of much more historical importance, for being historically inaccurate? Why attack Bonnie and Clyde more than the other movies based on the same pair, or more than the movie treatments of Jesse James, or Billy the Kid, or Dillinger, or Capone, or any of our other fictionalized outlaws? I would suggest that when a movie so clearly conceived as a new version of a legend is attacked as historically inaccurate, it's because it shakes people a little. I know this is based on some pretty sneaky psychological suppositions, but I don't see how else to account for the use only against a good movie of arguments that could be used against almost all movies. When I asked a 19-year-old boy who was raging against the movie as a cliché-ridden fraud if he got so worked up about other movies, he informed me that that was an argument ad hominem. And it is indeed. To ask why people react so angrily to the best movies and have so little negative reaction to poor ones is to imply that they are so unused to the experience of art in movies that they fight it. Audiences at Bonnie and Clyde are not given a simple, secure basis for identification. They are made to feel, but are not told how to feel. Bonnie and Clyde is not a serious melodrama involving us in the plight of the innocent, but a movie that assumes, as William Wellman did in 1931 when he made The Public Enemy with James Cagney as a smart, cocky, mean little crook, that we don't need to pretend we're interested only in the falsely accused, as if real criminals had no connection with us. There wouldn't be the popular excitement there is about outlaws if we didn't all suspect that, in some cases at least, gangsters must take pleasure in the profits and glory of a life of crime. Outlaws wouldn't become legendary figures if we didn't suspect that there's more to crime than the social workers' case studies may show. And though what we've always been told will happen to them, that they'll come to a bad end, does seem to happen, some part of us wants to believe in the tiny possibility that they can get away with it. Is that really so terrible? Yet when it comes to movies, people get nervous about acknowledging that there must be some fun in crime, though the gleam in Cagney's eye told its own story. Bonnie and Clyde shows the fun, but uses it too, milking comedy out of the banality and conventionality of that fun. What looks ludicrous in this movie isn't merely ludicrous, and after we have laughed at ignorance and helplessness and emptiness and stupidity and idiotic deviltry, the laughs keep sticking in our throats, because what's funny isn't only funny. In 1937, movie makers knew that the audience wanted to believe in the innocence of Joan and Eddie, because these two were lovers, and innocent lovers, hunted down like animals, made a tragic love story. In 1967, the movie makers know that the audience wants to believe, and maybe even prefers to believe, that Bonnie and Clyde were guilty of crimes all right, but that they were innocent in general. That is, naive and ignorant compared with us. The distancing of the 60s version shows the gangsters in an already legendary period, and part of what makes a legend for Americans is viewing anything that happened in the past as much simpler than what we are involved in now. We tend to find the past funny, and the recent past campy funny. The getaway cars of the early 30s are made to seem hilarious. Imagine anyone getting away from a bank holdup in a Tin Lizzie like that. In You Only Live Once, the outlaws existed in the same present as the audience, and there was, and still is, I'm sure, nothing funny about them. In Bonnie and Clyde, the audience is in the movie, transformed into the poor people, the depression people, of legend, with faces and poses out of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, and Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. In 1937, the audience felt sympathy for the fugitives because they weren't allowed to lead normal lives. In 1967, the normality of the Barrow Gang and their individual aspirations toward respectability are the craziest things about them. Not just because they're killers, but because 30s normality is in itself funny to us. The writers and the director of Bonnie and Clyde play upon our attitudes toward the American past by making the hats and guns and hold-ups look as dated as too real comedy. Emphasizing the absurdity with banjo music, they make the period seem even farther away than it is. The Depression reminiscences are not used for purposes of social consciousness. Hard times are not the reason for the Barrows crimes, just the excuse. We didn't make Clyde a killer. The movie deliberately avoids easy sympathy by picking up Clyde when he is already a cheap crook. But Clyde is not the urban sharpster of The Public Enemy. He is the hick as bank robber, a countrified gangster, a hillbilly killer who doesn't mean any harm. People so simple that they are alienated from the results of their actions, like the primitives who don't connect babies with copulation, provide a kind of archetypal comedy for us. It may seem like a minor point that Bonnie and Clyde are presented as not mean and sadistic, as having killed only when cornered, but in terms of legend, and particularly movie legend, it's a major one. The classic gangster films showed gang members betraying each other and viciously murdering the renegade who left to join another gang. The gangster hero no sooner got to the top than he was betrayed by someone he had trusted or someone he had double-crossed. In contrast, the Barrow Gang represent family-style crime. And Newman and Benton have been acute in emphasizing this, not making them victims of society. They are never that, despite Penn's cloudy efforts along these lines, but making them absurdly just folks ordinary. When Bonnie tells Clyde to pull off the road, "I want to talk to you," they are in a getaway car, leaving the scene of a robbery with the police right behind them. But they are absorbed in family bickering, the traditional all-American use of the family automobile. In a sense, it is the absence of sadism. It is the violence without sadism that throws the audience off balance at Bonnie and Clyde. The brutality that comes out of this innocence is far more shocking than the calculated brutalities of mean killers. Playfully posing with their guns, the real Bonnie and Clyde mocked the bloody barrows of the Hearst press. One photograph shows slim, pretty Bonnie, smiling and impeccably dressed, pointing a huge gun at Clyde's chest, as he, a dimpled dude with a cigar, smiles back. The famous picture of Bonnie in the same clothes, but looking ugly, squinting into the sun, with a foot on the car, a gun on her hip, and a cigar in her mouth, is obviously a joke, her caricature of herself as a gun moll. Probably, since they never meant to kill, they thought the bloody barrels were a joke, a creation of the lying newspapers. There's something new working for the Bonnie and Clyde legend now. Our nostalgia for the 30s, the unpredictable, contrary affection of the prosperous for poverty, or at least for the artifacts, the tokens of poverty, for pop culture seen in the dreariest rural settings, where it truly seems to belong. Did people in the cities listen to the Eddie Cantor show? No doubt they did, but the sound of his voice, like the sound of Ed Sullivan now, evokes a primordial pre-urban existence, the childhood of the race. Our comic, melancholic affection for 30s pop has become 60s pop, and those who made Bonnie and Clyde are smart enough to use it that way. Being knowing is not an artist's highest gift, but it can make a hell of a lot of difference in a movie. In the American experience, the miseries of the Depression are funny in the way that the Army is funny to draftees, a shared catastrophe, a leveling, forming part of our common background. Those too young to remember the Depression have heard about it from their parents. When I was at college, we used to top each other's stories about how our families had survived. The fathers who had committed suicide so that their wives and children could live off the insurance. The mothers trying to make a game out of the meals of potatoes cooked on an open fire. Though the American derision of the past has many offensive aspects, it has some good ones too, because it's a way of making fun, not only of our forebears, but of ourselves and our pretensions. The toughness about what we've come out of and what we've been through, the honesty to see ourselves as the Yahoo children of yokels, is a good part of American popular art. There is a kind of American poetry in a stick-up gang seen chasing across the bedraggled backdrop of the Depression, as true in its way as Nabokov's vision of Humbert Humbert and Lolita in the cross-country world of motels, as if crime were the only activity in a country stupefied by poverty. But Arthur Penn doesn't quite have the toughness of mind to know it. It's not what he means by poetry. His Squatter's Jungle scene is too eloquent, like a poster making an appeal, and the Parker family reunion sequence is poetic in the gauzy mode. He makes the sequence a fancy lyric interlude, like a number in a musical, Funny Face to be exact. It's too imaginative a literal dust bowl, as thoroughly becalmed as Sleeping Beauty's garden. The movie becomes dreamy soft where it should be hard and hard-edged. If there is such a thing as an American tragedy, it must be funny. O'Neill undoubtedly felt this when he had James Tyrone get up to turn off the lights in Long Day's Journey into Night. We are bumpkins, haunted by the bottle of ketchup on the dining table at San Simeon. We garble our foreign words and phrases and hope that at least we've used them right. Our heroes pick up the wrong fork, and the basic figure of fun in the American theater and American movies is the man who puts on airs. Children of peddlers and hod carriers don't feel at home in tragedy. We are used to failure. But because of the quality of American life at the present time, perhaps there can be no real comedy, nothing more than stupidity and spoof, without true horror in it. Bonnie and Clyde and their partners in crime are comically bad bank robbers, and the backdrop of poverty makes their hold-ups seem pathetically tacky. Yet they rob banks and kill people. Clyde and his good-natured brother are so shallow they never think much about anything. Yet they suffer and die. If this way of holding more than one attitude toward life is already familiar to us, if we recognize the make-believe robbers whose toy guns produce real blood, and the Keystone Cops who shoot them dead, from Truffaut's Shoot the Piano Player, and Godard's gangster pictures, Breathless and Band of Outsiders, it's because the young French directors discovered the poetry of crime in American life from our own movies, and showed the Americans how to put it on the screen in a new existential way. Melodramas and gangster movies and comedies were always more our speed than prestigious, distinguished pictures. The French directors who grew up on American pictures found poetry in our fast action, laconic speech, plain gestures. And because they understood that you don't express your love of life by denying the comedy or the horror of it, they brought out the poetry in our tawdry subjects. Now Arthur Penn, working with a script heavily influenced, one might almost say inspired, by Truffaut's Shoot the Piano Player, unfortunately imitates Truffaut's artistry instead of going back to its tough American sources. The French may tenderize their American material, but we shouldn't. That turns into another way of making prestigious, distinguished pictures. Probably part of the discomfort that people feel about Bonnie and Clyde grows out of its compromises and its failures. I wish the script hadn't provided the upbeat of the hero's sexual success as a kind of sop to the audience. I think what makes us not believe in it is that it isn't consistent with the intelligence of the rest of the writing, that it isn't on the same level because it's too manipulatively clever, too much of a gimmick. The scene that shows the gnomish gang member called C.W. sleeping in the same room with Bonnie and Clyde suggests other possibilities, perhaps discarded, as does C.W.'s reference to Bonnie's liking his tattoo. Compromises are not new to the Bonnie and Clyde story. You Only Live Once had attacked on Coda, featuring a heavenly choir and William Gargan as a dead priest, patronizing Eddie even in the afterlife, welcoming him to heaven with, "You're free, Eddie." The kind of people who make a movie like You Only Live Once are not the kind who write endings like that. And by the same sort of internal evidence, I'd guess that Newman and Benton, whose Bonnie seems to owe so much to Catherine in Jules and Jim, had more interesting ideas originally about Bonnie's and Clyde's, and maybe CW's sex lives. But people also feel uncomfortable about the violence, and here I think they're wrong. That is to say, they should feel uncomfortable, but this isn't an argument against the movie. Only a few years ago, a good director would have suggested the violence obliquely, with reaction shots like the famous one in The Golden Coach, when we see a whole bullfight reflected in Anna Magnani's face. And death might have been symbolized by a light going out, or stylized with blood and wounds kept to a minimum. In many ways, this method is more effective. We feel the violence more, because so much is left to our imaginations. But the whole point of Bonnie and Clyde is to rub our noses in it, to make us pay our dues for laughing. The dirty reality of death, not suggestions but blood and holes, is necessary. Though I generally respect a director's skill and intelligence in inverse ratio to the violence he shows on the screen, and though I questioned even the Annie Sullivan-Helen Keller fight scenes in Arthur Penn's The Miracle Worker, I think that this time Penn is right. I also think he was right when he showed violence in his first film, The Left-Handed Gun, in 1958. Suddenly, in the last few years, our view of the world has gone beyond good taste. Tasteful suggestions of violence would, at this point, be a more grotesque form of comedy than Bonnie and Clyde attempts. Bonnie and Clyde needs violence. Violence is its meaning. When, during a comically botched-up getaway, a man is shot in the face, the image is obviously based on one of the most famous sequences in Eisenstein's Potemkin, and the startled face is used the same way it was in Potemkin, to convey in an instant how someone who just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, the irrelevant, innocent bystander, can get it full in the face. And at that instant, the meaning of Clyde Barrow's character changes. He's still a clown, but we've become the butt of the joke. That is more than half an hour, and I am halfway into this. Thanks for all the heavy labor, Ranger Girl. I will continue this tomorrow and post it sometime. Thank you for listening so far, and I'll continue it, and we'll see where she goes.